I'm Zach Corrigan for the Global Workers Inquest into the COVID-19 pandemic, and today we'll be hearing testimony from Aaron, a musician in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Welcome, Aaron. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Zach. Glad to be here.
Before the pandemic, Aaron was a professional music performer, performing at several paid gigs every month, where he could also sell recordings and merchandise. But like artists across the US and internationally, Aaron's artistic livelihood was wiped out, a casualty of the government's disastrous and ongoing class-based response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, with the extremely contagious BA.2 variant spreading, and as more than 7,000 people died from COVID this week in the US alone, the Biden administration, like nearly every government in the world outside China, is declaring the pandemic over. Aaron, in this context, could you describe the atmosphere in your part of the world? Tell our international audience a bit about Virginia Beach and describe what conditions are like there now after 2 years of the pandemic, but at a time when everyone's being told that it's over.
Oh yeah, you would think that it was over here at my job. No one wears a mask except for me.
And where do you work, or what type of a job is it?
So I work at a restaurant, sort of just surrounded on all sides by massive military installations. So there's a naval air station in one direction, amphibious base in another direction, joint expeditionary base in the other direction. Anywhere I go, from my home or my job, it's all about the military, which is, it does create a certain kind of environment, I guess. There's photos of aircraft carriers on every wall and jets, and that's the atmosphere. So I work in the back of the house. I work as a cook. Fortunately, I get to work under a big ventilation system. I get to wear my mask. I get funny looks, but people have stopped asking me.
So how has your life changed since the pandemic hit?
Oh man, well, it's changed dramatically in that a large part of my focus in life has been around artistic self-expression. I mean, it's pretty much my reason for being. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was gaining a lot of momentum, like for my band, one of my bands specifically, and then my other projects as well. I was getting a lot. I could play anywhere I wanted in Norfolk, just getting invites to more gigs than I could handle or even wanted to do, really. So it was going very well. I was making my own merchandise, so I had my garage converted into a screen printing studio. Still had to work. I had a part-time restaurant job. It's like 25 hours a week, maybe, a little bit of tips, a regular hourly wage, a very low one, but still, I was able to art more, work less. And then March happened and all my shows were canceled or postponed. My job shut down. Really right away went on unemployment. So I got paid enough to pay my rent, to pay my bills, live a very minimal lifestyle. No extra expenditure whatsoever, just food and bills, and stay in my house. I went to doing live stream performances, which in a small way, I could make money. You could put virtual tip jar. Me and my colleagues put together some performances where it only took 3 or 5 of us to put it together. But that sort of fizzled out. It didn't lead to any selling of any records or any merchandise. It didn't lead to expanding an audience or anything like that. It's pretty much just my core people tuned in for the first couple ones and then kind of dropped off. And then my job opened back up and they called me to come back into work. And I came back into work and really immediately discovered that they had done nothing to comply with the new restrictions on businesses. So there was no protection between me and the other employees, between the employees and the customers. It was just as if there was nothing going on. There was a little stack of cloth masks. And at the time, me and most other people didn't know that those masks weren't effective. I mean, CDC was still withholding their knowledge of aerosol transmission. I didn't even know. I thought, oh, cloth mask, cool, we're good to go. I went back to work. Things seemed okay the first day. My boss called me and asked me what my thoughts are on coming back to work. And I said, man, this sucks. I think, and everyone thinks that this is a premature decision. It's just a restaurant. It's not essential. Maybe, you should pump the brakes on this and wait to see what this virus is really going to do. At which point he told me about his opinions, which were basically, I've never once worn a mask. I'm never going to wear a mask. Basically the whole hoax. This is a hoax. Go back to work kind of deal. So I went back to work, and the third day, they allowed so many people in the restaurant that it exceeded our actual capacity. They allowed more people than actually would be normally our capacity, even though we're supposed to be operating under the COVID rules, limited capacity, and other things like customers have to wear a mask. They can't sit at the bar. They can't be all over top of each other. They have to be at a table, this, and that. None of those rules were abided by. In fact, the owner and the bartenders were like, hell yeah, we haven't worked so long. Come on, let's get this money. And they let so many people in that they were on top of each other. I can't distance myself from my coworkers. Day 3, I quit. I was like, this is not safe. Mm-hmm. Turned in my keys. They didn't need an explanation. They knew what was up. I tried to go back on unemployment, wrote a really long letter to the Virginia Employment Commission, dozens and dozens of phone calls. I got my unemployment insurance turned back on. For a few months, I continued to get checks and not work. And then that dried up. And dozens of phone calls later, I got no explanation as to why I could not reapply for unemployment insurance. And I talked to a lot of my friends. Some of my coworkers were still getting checks without going back to work. Other people were being cut off. It seemed like really random in Virginia at that time as whether you could actually get through the system and get your checks. It was chaotic. So there's plenty of people that were in my situation. And then my landlord says he's going to sell the house that I live in. So now I'm faced with, well, I don't have an employment history for the last year. I don't have any money saved. How am I going to get, to rent a place, just as a person who makes a low wage? I mean, let's face it, like you got to have first and last month's rent, deposit on all your bills. You have to be able to prove that you make 3 times what the rent is. But who can even do that? What kind of single individual can even afford that? And so I was like, what am I going to do? My sister, she said, okay, you can move in with me. So I was able to live with her rent-free for a few months while searching for a job, which is the job I have now in the area I live in now. So I'm back to working 40 plus hours a week, scraping by, living with a roommate.
I wanted to read something here and then maybe discuss it with you. Just a passage from an article that was written on the WSWS from April 4th, 2021. The title of the article is The Art World in 2021, Artists Struggle for Rent and Food, Billionaire Collectors Thrive. According to a study, the jobless rate for art directors, fine artists, and animators increased from 2.1% in 2019 to 9.3% in 2020. For actors, the rate went from 24.7% in 2019 to 52.3% in 2020. For dancers and choreographers, from 10.7% to 54.6%. And for musicians, singers, and related workers, from 1.1% to 27.1%. Much of this job destruction and structural downsizing will prove, in fact, to be permanent. Financial losses to nonprofit arts and culture organizations in the U.S. stand, quote, at an estimated $15.7 billion to date. Some 99% of producing and presenting organizations have canceled events, a loss of 490 million admissions, and $15.5 billion in audience spending at local businesses like restaurants, lodging, and retail parking. The total economic impact of organizational and audience spending losses is 5.3 billion in lost government revenue, and 913,000 jobs are no longer being supported. Artists, quote, are among the most severely affected workers by the pandemic, end of quote, according to the study. The update estimates that 63% of artists or creative workers, quote, became fully unemployed in 2020 and have lost an average of $37,430 each in creativity-based income since the pandemic's onset, end of quote. 95% of artists report loss of income, while 78% have, quote, no post-pandemic financial recovery plan. 50% have been unable to distribute their creative product, and 74% have had their events canceled. Does that resonate with you? Does it sound like your experience and that of those that you know?
Of course it does. I was feeling a lot of those hits because of working in the service industry and being an artist and just seeing like the lack of hope among other artists. I don't have any plan. There is no post-pandemic plan. For me, it wasn't like really about money so much. It was about like the experience of like the collective experience, bringing people together, like all being able to share this emotional language that music is, you know, together. That's part of being human. That's part of being alive. That's like, we need that, you know, as human beings, we need that. And that's why we have Mardi Gras, Carnival. That's why people get together in church and hold hands and sing, you know. Part of the reason.
No, it's a deep cultural need. Everyone needs art, entertainment to help them to understand and to cope with life and enrich their lives. Art and music are an extremely important part of society. There's something that has been developed, you know, by our society over thousands of years. They fulfill an important social role. You had in an earlier phase of the pandemic, the fact that the government wasn't willing to do a quick shutdown and pay everyone to stay home and get the pandemic over with, which is what could have happened. I mean, there was a scientific response to this pandemic that was well known, and that governments in this country and in most countries in the world decided not to pursue. They would rather have 1 million people dead than lose, you know, a month's profit or 2 months profit to shut down and end the pandemic. So the pandemic is just prolonged and social life interrupted, and these important social experiences are denied us. Now they're saying, well, it's all over. So go out and have a good time again. Aren't you excited? And they're actually using it to entice people to forget the pandemic and to forget about the dangers that exist.
The need to perform and also to be part of an audience, the need to like experience cultural things is used. So like back in like May 13th, 2021, CDC said, if you're vaxxed, you can unmask. And then for me, like that's when the calls really started coming in. Festival organizers, show promoters, galleries. Hey, show's back on, you know, my postponed shows are back on. Like and I'm going, no, like absolutely not. This thing is not over. We haven't even seen what's going to happen yet. This is like pre-Delta, right? So it's like every principled epidemiologist knows there's going to be more variants, that knows that we can't just go do this, get into large crowds. But it started happening. I mean, they had like a Lollapalooza, like right away, thousands of people, super spreader event. There's no doubt in my mind that there were deaths associated with people having gone to that, to their families. I mean, I don't need to explain.
If there are super spreader events happening in the community, you know, those people all have jobs and they all go shopping and they all interact with everybody else. So you're absolutely right, is what I'm saying. That's correct.
That need to get back to it was used to normalize death in a sense, to create like this social crime. And so I'm on the phone with promoters going, no, what you're doing is reckless and irresponsible. And they're going, well, CD said, you know, mask off. I'm vaxxed. If you're not vaxxed, no show. And I'm going, well, I am vaxxed. That does not stop transmission. Like, we know this now, but we're made to feel like what we're doing is stubborn or cowardly. It's actually quite brave, I think, to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to spread and be a vector for a deadly disease. I'm not going to draw a crowd together. The point that you made is that this like need, this whatever psychological deep need we have for these cultural interactions and experiences is being used to make us feel like there's a certain amount of death that we just have to accept. But that is ridiculous. I know I'm not alone in feeling this way. And I want to say this to reach out to other artists who are feeling the same way. if you're not putting together large or any groups of people unnecessarily, then you are doing the right thing. You're wearing a mask, you are doing the right thing. You're thinking about not just yourself, but your community at large. You're thinking about the vulnerable, thinking about the elderly. And this is, it's super important to understand that your sort of lust for life is being used against you to go out there and live. Just don't let it bother you.
Let's talk about thinking. You were just talking about the problems of how people think about the pandemic. And I wanted to ask you, how has the experience of the pandemic and the government's response to it impacted your own thinking about the world and how it works, I guess?
The whole quarantine and everything, it gave me actual time to myself, where I wasn't working all the time to develop myself politically. And there were times where I felt like the World Socialist website was a bit of a guiding light. Like if I didn't have that, I wouldn't know anything about what was going on because there's no one else who was taking the time. In the early stages of the pandemic, where the virus was breaking out in factories all over the place and meatpacking plants, I mean, that hits home. Like if a lot of family, I mean, here in Virginia, we have Tyson and Smithfield. When that was happening, there was no other organization who was actually talking to workers. And so many articles. I mean, the World Socialist website has published hundreds of articles on the pandemic. Not like giving it lip service when it needs to so that it can maintain like a left face, but like really on the ground, journalism, this is what's happening. And for me, that made me respect the organization a lot. So I guess that did actually, in that respect, it did have a huge influence on me politically. Because from that respect, from going, okay, these are the people that are telling the truth, fashionable or not, from that came a respect to want to dive in deeper to the program and be like, well, who are these guys? From that, that coverage, Benjamin Mateus, Evan Blake, I mean, like I said, there's hundreds of articles. So those of us who understand are developing an understanding that will take a movement of the working class to enact the policies that it will take to put an end to this crap. That's invaluable. And it's been invaluable in my life. It's been like a source of like, there's part of me that just wants to be demoralized and just throw my head in the sand and say, it's over. But then there's this other part that's being kept alive. It's this struggle and this feeling of like being connected to other workers. And I have that because I've discovered the World Socialist website and done everything I can to get other people to read it. So yeah, that in that respect, the COVID situation has brought me further along politically than I ever felt like I have been before.
You emphasize the working class several times. And I think that's key to it. Why is the World Socialist website able to tell the truth about the pandemic? It's because we are fighting for the interests of the working class. And that's the class that needs to know this and needs to not pretend that it's over. We're trying to unleash the working class as a force that can not only understand the pandemic, but can be mobilized to fight against it. One of the things the World Socialist website has written about that almost nobody else in the West has is what's happened in China. 1.4
billion people in their country, 4,636 deaths. The United States, for instance, 330 million people, nearly 1 million deaths. And when you read about China or you read about the United States, it's always put in terms of the impact it has on financial markets. I don't accept this whole idea that we have to weigh the value of human life against the financial markets. And it seems like in China, they have proven to the rest of the world that you do not have to do that. In fact, it might be more beneficial if you pull out all the stops and do every single thing you can to track down every single infected individual. And China is densely populated, the massive cities, massive. If it can be done there, it can be done in Orlando. or it can be done in Montana or in New York City. The zero COVID policy needs to be implemented in every corner of the earth. I feel very passionately about this because I don't like needless death. That's the point. Preventable death. And having people that I know who get a little sick and then they're fine, and then a month later have crazy heart palpitations or brain fog, early onset Alzheimer's. I mean, how much of this is acceptable? I don't care if every billionaire ends up a pauper. We can take that money and put it towards a zero COVID-19 policy and knock this thing off the face of the earth. That's what I have to say about that. I can't argue with me about zero COVID. That's what we need. Every corner of the earth needs a zero COVID.
Yeah, very, very clearly said. Thank you. On top of the COVID-19 pandemic, we now have a new war. The same forces, in fact, that have been responsible for the disastrous response to the emergence of COVID-19 are now leading the way into a war in the Ukraine, pitting the U.S. and its NATO allies against Russia, each side with enormous nuclear arsenals. There's a lot of propaganda being put out in the media everywhere about it's virtually everything that you hear about Ukraine is propaganda, and it's very difficult to learn what's really going on there. But I wanted to know, what is your view?
It needs to be opposed. Putin's actions are reckless and indefensible. They need to be opposed. The U.S. and NATO buildup to this war needs to be opposed. The massive armament of right-wing militias in Ukraine needs to be opposed. The whole goal of NATO expanding and expanding and expanding over the last 30 years to every side of Russia needs to be opposed, because the goal is, as far as I can see, is to reduce Russia to like a semi-colonial state or a group of states, like to break it up and grab the spoils, the breadbasket. It's the biggest problem. I think the biggest hurdle is to get past the propaganda that you mentioned. I mean, the Ukrainian nationalism / American U.S. nationalism is it's alarming, and it doesn't make any sense. 2 months ago, none of my coworkers gave a damn about the Ukraine, nor did they know what was going on in Crimea or Donbass. And it ties to the pandemic. I mean, for one thing, we need a huge distraction. The working class needs to be distracted from their real class enemy, who's watching them die of a disease, and make them focus on an external enemy, even if it's a boogeyman. Putin was baited into attacking the Ukraine and overnight became the perfect boogeyman. He's the new Saddam. He's the new Gaddafi. People need to understand that this buildup of NATO is part of a plan that has been in place for decades. And it's really ultimately going to shift to China as well, the other giant nuclear armed power. This is like the kind of opposition that needs to come from below, from the working class, that is like a life and death type situation. It's another thing it has in common with the pandemic. So the ruling class doesn't care if 1 million people die from a pandemic. Do they really care if 1 million people die from a nuclear blast? 1 million or 2 million? Do they really care? I feel like we've been conditioned to accept death to a level where people are now openly debating whether we should nuke each other. What kind of barbaric kind of philosophy is that? There is no good guy and there will be no winner. If there is a nuclear war, I shouldn't have to say that. Like, that should be understood. But people are, again, it's just like with the pandemic, people are so bombarded with propaganda and misinformation that they're being pulled this way and that way. And if they never had time or even a reason to develop politically or to look at history, they're going to have no context within which to put this war. this conflict in Ukraine has been underway for a long time. You can go back to the 2014 regime change, was backed by US and Germany, that took out a democratically elected pro-Russian government. But you can go farther back than that, to the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the United States and NATO powers openly saying the ultimate goal is to destabilize Russia so that we can destabilize China, to break it up, to separate it. I mean, so in that case, it's not a lot different than the tactics of to divide and conquer, which happened in the Balkans and in the Middle East. If we let this go on, we're going to destroy entire civilizations. So yeah, it needs to be opposed, not by buying into the nationalism of Team A or Team B.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the working class has an independent interest in this. That's who has an interest in stopping the war. The workers of Ukraine, Russia, United States, Europe, and the whole world have an interest in uniting and stopping a nuclear war from breaking out. Because it'll just, as you said, it'll destroy civilizations. Perhaps it'll destroy the basis of civilization everywhere. And that, I think, brings us to the reason behind this inquest, because we're fighting, in the case of the pandemic, as well as the war, to develop an understanding and a leadership in the working class that will develop a revolution more quickly than the war will develop. And I think that your contribution today to the inquest has gone some way toward helping to clarify the issues that workers need to understand. So I want to thank you very much for participating in this and for joining us today, Aaron.
You're welcome, Zach. Thank you.